In Kyiv, a 7-year-old girl was rescued from a building that was struck by a missile, according to Ukrainian authorities.
The leaders of the world's 7 richest democracies are meeting in Germany to discuss how to help Ukraine and hinder Russia's invasion.
A city mourns the day after a gunman killed 2 people outside an LGBTQ+ nightclub in Norway's capital. Missiles in Kyiv have struck at least 2 residential buildings, and the first Russian airstrike on the city since June 5th. In total, 14 missiles targeted the city on Sunday morning, according to Ukrainian authorities. A fire broke out in one of the buildings, and rescue workers tried to evacuate people. They pulled a 7-year-old girl out of the wreckage. According to the city's mayor, several other people are still trapped under the rubble. And he added that he believed the strikes were meant to intimidate Ukrainians ahead of the next NATO summit. The alliance is planning to meet from June 28th to the 30th in Madrid. The strikes also came a day after the city imposed a new curfew, limiting people's movement from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. The last airstrike on the Ukrainian capital targeted a factory, leaving 1 person injured.
The leaders of the world's 7 richest democracies have begun discussions on how they can better support Ukraine whilst ratcheting up the pressure on Russia. It's greatly complicated by the dangerous rise in global energy prices, which could yet trigger a global recession, and the rise in global food prices, which could see famines break out. The EU's Commission President tweeted her unwavering support for Ukraine. Although it's not strictly a G7 member, the EU is a guest at the talks. We will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. The negative global impact of Russia's war will be front and centre of our exchanges at the G7. And the UK leader Boris Johnson said, now's not the time to give up on Ukraine. We know that their security is our security.
The Kremlin is using food as a silent weapon of war, and we must vigorously counter Russia's propaganda about food and fertilizer prices. Russia's dangerous Hunger Games is solely responsible for the global food crisis. Families, children at risk of starvation, they need this food now. Time is running out, and the EU is working on alternative foods for Ukrainian agricultural products.
Before the meeting began, the UK, the US, Japan and Canada announced they'd ban new imports of Russian gold. Moscow had been raising money by selling off some of its gold reserves. Other countries will join in some of the G7's meetings, including Argentina, India, Senegal and South Africa.
The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, says talks between the US and Iran will resume in the coming days, after flying to Iran for talks with Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian. Negotiations between the nuclear powers stalled as Iran proceeded to produce uranium closer than ever to weapon-grade levels. Mr. Amir-Abdollahian spoke about why a resolution would be ideal for the country.
Getting the full economic benefits of the 2015 agreement is important for Iran.
Meanwhile, Borrell also spoke about the urgency to find a solution.
3 months have passed, and we need to speed up our work.
The 2015 agreement was struck between Iran, the US, the EU and other world powers to curb Tehran's nuclear activities in return for relief from economic sanctions. It remains unclear whether the indirect talks will lead to a deal, with both sides having differences on issues concerning sanctions.
People gathered to lay flowers and pride flags where a tragic shooting took place on Saturday. Around 1 a.m. that morning, a gunman opened fire in 3 locations in Norway's capital, including an LGBTQ+ nightclub, killing 2 people and injuring 21 more. The event took place hours before Oslo's Pride Parade was meant to begin, and it devastated the city's LGBTQ+ community. The country's crown prince was one of the mourners at the site, and he told reporters, "It is important that we defend who we are. That Norway is a country where people are allowed to love who they want, and be with who they want. That was meant to be marked today, but it was not like that. We saw it for ourselves. So it's important that we stand up for our rights and our values. Oslo's Pride Parade was postponed after the shooting, which authorities called an Islamist terror act. However, they added that it's too early to determine if the shooter specifically targeted the LGBTQ+ community.
Warsaw hosted the biggest Pride Parade in Central Europe on Sunday, in a country that's run by an anti-LGBTQ+ government. This year it was joined by Ukraine's Pride Parade that would normally have been held in Kyiv. In Warsaw, we allow ourselves to walk around holding hands, and there's less and less judgment as time goes by. But it's obvious that we have stress. The ruling party despises us as much as they can, so we have to fend for ourselves. For the Ukrainians at the parade, the war overshadows everything else. Just hours before, Russia struck 2 apartment blocks in Kyiv with missiles.
This year, rather than marching for human rights for LGBTQI people, we are marching for human rights that has been taken from us by Russian aggression.
Bosnia's capital Sarajevo hosted only its 3rd Pride March, with a special emphasis on bringing families with LGBTQ+ relatives closer together. When the city held its first parade in 2019, it attracted protests. And on Saturday, thousands also paraded through Mexico City, in a country where many also oppose LGBTQ+ rights. In much of rural Mexico, the community continues to endure violent attacks. These marches are for those people who cannot go out. Our cry and the things we shout and the banners we raise are not for us. They're for the people who live in the closet, who live with this systematic sexist violence. And it's more important for me to shout out and say, here we are. And Filipinos proudly paraded through their capital, Manila, on Sunday. Parades have been held since 1994, the year 30 or so activists first took to the streets to celebrate their identity.
A new museum tells the story of generations of refugees housed in Denmark. The museum float, which means escape in Danish, was built on the country's largest refugee camp, where 35,000 German refugees lived after World War II. And it is meant to depict their lives, in addition to the lives of other refugees, such as those fleeing Lebanon, Hungary, and Vietnam.
When you hear about refugees throughout the world today, you hear about huge numbers, faceless numbers, all sometimes frightening high numbers of people coming to your country. But we want to tell the story that behind these numbers there are actual persons.
Denmark has a large immigrant population, with more than 650,000 immigrants currently living in the country. But in recent years, it has made moves to restrict the number of people who are able to settle in Denmark. In 2016, it passed a new law that allowed it to seize assets from refugees to pay for their housing.
Their first gig was in the Marquee in London in 1962. Now for their anniversary tour, the Rolling Stones returned to the UK capital to perform at Hyde Park, with performer Mick Jagger stealing the show. Appropriately, 60,000 fans gathered for the 60-year celebration. Beside Jagger featured guitarist Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood, who showed no sign of age, dancing and jumping around the stage. The group were also joined by Steve Jordan on the drums, following the death of drummer Charlie Watts, who died aged 80 last year. The Rolling Stones treated the crowd to all the classics, opening with Street Fighting Man and 19th Nervous Breakdown. The concert was Jagger's first outing on stage after the singer contracted COVID-19, forcing the group to cancel gigs in Amsterdam and Bern at short notice. They have been rescheduled for later dates in July.
You better stop.